So as Gary mentioned, we're working with the Navy. We in the state of Hawaii are working with the Navy to come up with a plan to improve Red Hill. We are looking at things such as fuel isolation, so if there's any kind of leaks within the system, it can be isolated and it doesn't flow out into larger areas or affect the Red Hill shaft. We're looking at things like evaluation and controlling any kind of corrosion and metal problems, looking at opportunities to improve leak detection, evaluating secondary containment, and working on looking at opportunities for revised response plans.
We're going to have one final presentation from Captain Mike Williamson.
Mike Williamson, I'm the CEO of NAVFAC Hawaii, as Gary mentioned. I am also the regional engineer for the Navy Region Hawaii as well. So we've talked about our immediate response. We are following the regulations. We got the word out quickly. We started coordinating right away with Department of Health and Board of Water Supply on the monitoring increased frequency of sampling. And thank you. We sprung into action very quickly. So the emergency response was spot on. And as Gary has mentioned, we have a number of continuing actions that are ongoing. We're installing additional monitoring wells. We've awarded a number of contracts to increase our awareness and understanding of any type of contamination that might be in the ground at Red Hill and where or how it might be moving through the material underneath Red Hill, and make sure that we understand and have all the tools in place to protect our drinking water sources. So we are moving forward with that. Wow, good. Okay, so lower left-hand side, again, to put context to the tank, that's a gentleman, one of the inspectors starting the visual inspection inside the tank. And so you can see the massive size. It is 225 feet tall by 125 feet in diameter. Next slide. So we're taking a very deliberate process that Gary has referred to. And so we're starting with the very first premise, making sure that drinking water is safe. And then we're taking progressive measures to make sure that we understand up gradient, what's happening as groundwater moves through and around the Red Hill facility in the direction of our drinking water. We're taking a look at and studying the pathways of potential contamination in our groundwater. We're actively looking for where that 27,000 gallons may have gone, and any previous fuel releases where that may have gone, so we understand and are taking precautions to keep our drinking water safe. So if I may, just to talk just a second about how we arrived at 27,000 gallons. So we were in the Tank 5 had been taken out of commission for 4 years. And it wasn't going through a repair cycle, it was going through a service life extension cycle. So our goal when we go in and take a look at one of these tanks is to clean it, inspect it, and put appropriate measures in place so that that tank, when we restore to operation, is safe for the next 20 years. That's our goal when we get into a tank. So we're not repairing defects in a sense. What we're doing is extending the life of that tank for another 20 years. I think that's an important point. So we had completed that work, and we began filling the tank. And we expect over time, as we're filling that tank, that it's going to expand and contract a little bit as we're filling that tank. So we expect some fluctuation in the fuel level as we put it in that dynamic process. We monitor down to 1/16 of an inch as we're filling the tank. And we have action levels that we take when that tolerance exceeds 3/16 of an inch. And so we went through the filling process. It takes about a month. And as we were completing that filling process, we saw some discrepancies in the logs that were greater than 3/16 of an inch. And we saw that, we got out and we followed the operating procedures inside inside the Red Hill Tank Farm. We got out, we reviewed our records, we went out and put eyes on target, as we say in the Navy. And when we went down, we saw the fuel, what appeared to be fuel and water mixture coming out of the bottom of the tank, as Gary showed on one of his slides. We said, hey, Houston, we have a problem. That's when we reported it. And so when we went back and reviewed all of the different filling discrepancies, and you add all of that up, you come up with 5.5 inches 5.5 inches out of 225 feet high, that accounts for 27,000 gallons. So that's the maximum amount based on our records, our detailed inventory that we believe could have left the tank. It may be something less than that. And I think that's an important point. Okay, so next slide, please. So the first tenet, making sure our drinking water is safe. We have been taking quarterly drinking water samples from our Red Hill shaft dating back to pre-2000. And so we have a long history of data samples coming out of our Red Hill drinking water, Red Hill shaft. That analysis is performed by us in independent labs and shared with Department of Health. All of the samples taken at the Red Hill shaft fall well within federal regulatory standards. The drinking water is safe. Our most recent samples in April 2000, the 8th of April, the 10th of June, came back non-detect for any petroleum products in the drinking water, and we're pending waiting results for the most recent sample taken in July. Normally you take samples of your drinking water in a much longer duration, not on a quarterly basis. So we're actively making sure that our drinking water is safe. Next slide. Tenet number 2, monitoring. So this picture depicts on the right-hand side, you can see our Red Hill shaft, and the black dots represent the 20 tanks that are in Red Hill underneath the ground, and the green dots represent existing monitoring wells, groundwater monitoring wells. So we placed these wells based on a study that was done started in 1998 with some site characterization efforts, expanded in 2005, and so we installed a number of groundwater monitoring wells. And if you see on the left-hand side, there's a blue arrow. That blue arrow, based on our understanding at the time, was the general direction that groundwater was flowing. And so we saw that Red Hill shaft was probably the first area where any kind of contamination emanating from Red Hill would migrate to. So we put these groundwater monitoring wells in place, and based on a 2010 report, there was some discussion that perhaps groundwater may be flowing in a northerly direction. And so as a result of the incident in January, we are in the process of installing the 2 yellow pegs that are up there, 2 new groundwater monitoring wells on the north side, so that we understand if there's any flow of contamination in the direction of Halava shaft. Okay? So we expect those wells to go in the next couple of months, and we're working very closely with Gary and his team to get the necessary permits and start the construction of those wells. Next slide. Modeling, we're using state-of-the-art modeling technologies to understand and be able to predict what might happen with our aquifer and any groundwater that may flow in the direction of our Red Hill shaft or other wells. But I just want to point out that we've been very proactive going back to 1998 and in collaboration with Board of Water Supply and Department of Health in preparing these reports and gaining a greater and greater understanding of what's happening in and around Red Hill to protect this strategic asset for the Navy and our nation going forward. Next slide. Steve spoke about the challenges with the material underneath Red Hill. It's generally basalt. There are fractures and fissures, and so we have core samples. These are actual core samples that we drew as part of the studies that I just mentioned. And so it's not as easy as just going in and recovering anything that got into the ground. It flows and moves in the direction of these, and so it's a very complex dynamic, as Steve mentioned. So we are actively figuring that out, and we have a number of studies that will help us characterize and understand to the extent any fuel is in the ground, what the concentration levels are, the extent of it, and where it might be moving. Next slide. So once we have identified the site characterization, we've identified where the concentration of, if there's any fuel underneath the ground, we believe there is possibly fuel down there, the extent of it, then you can make a decision on, is it possible to remove that fuel? Do you do some type of remediation through bioventing or otherwise? Or do you simply contain it and let it degrade over time because it's not moving in the direction of our water source? So those are sort of the three strategies. Those all follow based on our site characterization investigation. Next slide. So here I just wanted to share the different actions that have happened over time with respect to Red Hill and the incident that occurred on the 13th of January, or we reported on 13th of January. So on the top, on the gray, are the things specific to Tank 5. So everything from reporting the leak on the 13th of January to emptying the tank very quickly thereafter, to exercising the warranty clause, as Gary talked about, entering the tank, erecting the boom gear and the man lifts to be able to get people to get in and start the detailed visual inspections. And then once we follow the visual inspections, to do non-destructive testing on areas of concern, and then to arrive at the results which we shared with the public, initially the 2 or 3 pinhole leaks, followed by the 15 and now 17, as we've completed our initial non-destructive testing inside Tank 5. Across the bottom are the number of contracts that Gary referred to. So we've awarded a groundwater protection plan update. We've awarded the modeling study that takes a look at contaminant fate and transport, and we've also awarded the site characterization study. The yellow blocks on the lower right-hand side, that's where we'll actually start the borings for site characterization to really get in and understand, as I showed you earlier, the extent of any contamination underneath the ground. We'll be drilling the 2 additional monitoring wells. And then, as Steve pointed out, we're very interested to understand what are the limits of technology, what are the things that we can do going forward to instill confidence in you and the general public and EPA and DOH and the Board of Water Supply that this facility is safe for all of us. So, we are on board with seeking out advanced leak detection and seeking out and pushing technology to ultimately get us to a point where secondary containment could be achieved inside the Red Hill complex. Next slide. This just shows the drilling rig. You can see on the left-hand side the terrain that we're working with in order to be able to drill the wells. We have to make sure that we protect our species, otherwise, do I get in trouble from you for that? Yeah, I probably do. So want to make sure we don't go awry because we've got a pretty good working relationship. Next slide. So initial tank, we initially got into the tank on the 7th of April. We started our detailed visual inspection on the 9th of June. We completed our visual inspection towards the end of June, and then we went back, and in our detailed site investigation, looking at the base, working our way up the walls, we pointed out areas of concern, areas where something didn't quite look right. A well didn't look right, something was ground off, a repair patch or a service life extension patch, just didn't look right. We circled that, we highlighted it. And then what you see on the right-hand side, this non-destructive testing, essentially we put a vacuum box on top of it. So much the same as you would take your bicycle tire and you'd fill your tire up as fast as you can, and you put some soap in the water and you stick your tire in there and you look for bubbles. Essentially, that's what we're doing inside this massive tank. We put this rig over top of where we saw an anomaly. We put some little soap and water on the back side of it. We seal this thing to the side of the tank, and we suck all the air out. And if we see bubbles coming through, that's where we have a problem. So what we've identified are 17 areas where this vacuum test, we saw bubbles. Okay, so that's the extent of it. These they're not necessarily visible to the naked eye, and so we are doing the calculations to see if that could account for up to 27,000 gallons to figure out exactly how much fuel may have or could have left the tank. Next slide. We've mentioned this a couple times already. We are working in close coordination with EPA and DOH. We meet on a weekly basis, and we are currently, as Gary mentioned, trying to working towards crafting a negotiated agreement that takes a look and improves the operations, the awareness, response actions, site characterization, and all the modeling and groundwater monitoring so that we all understand what the state of play is up at Red Hill, and then ultimately, the the holy grail, get to advanced leak detection, and ultimately secondary containment. And that's where we are. I think I had a couple other notes here. I think Gary mentioned that we've only had one reported release. Actually, I think I went back and did some homework. I think we've given you 5 reports since 1998. And it was interesting because since 1998, our records indicate only 6 gallons have spilled out of any of these tanks. And I don't know that they were spills outside tanks. I think there were spills with fuel that was already outside the tanks. But we did make 6 reports since 1998. The total pre-Tank 5 was 6 gallons. Talked about service life extension, vice repair, and the importance of that. Steve, I appreciate your comments about, why do tanks leak? When you lifted your tank, it was pouring stuff out of the tank. I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that that's what's going on at Red Hill. And so you did, and I appreciate that, speak to what the root cause of the most recent issue, and we believe that's a quality control concern, and we're taking a very close look at that to make sure that we learn all the lessons, understand the root cause, and never repeat that again. I'd just like to leave you with, we're spending a lot of money up there to improve, and this is a very modern facility. If you haven't, Scott, would you raise your hand? Scott Hendrick is one of our experts in operating the fuel. Captain Wheeler, would you raise your hand? He's my counterpart at the Fleet Logistics Command who operates the facility. A lot of state-of-the-art systems have been put in place. Tank level indication, they can get us to 1/16 of an inch inside that tank to understand how's fuel. It's state-of-the-art computers are constantly monitoring tank level and inventory movement. We have a watch 24/7 and protocols whenever any of the alarms that Steve, I think you mentioned that you have alarms and modern systems in our underground tanks now to warn folks that we may have a problem. We have similar systems right now in Red Hill. So, and we're going to be taking EPA and DOH through the Red Hill facility and having a detailed discussion this coming Thursday. Also share that, and Steve put a slide up on I believe his last slide. He showed the Red Hill shaft, our drinking water supply for the Navy, is inside that tunnel structure. And so we have a fiscal year 15 project, $60 million project, to go in and put oil-tight doors inside the tunnel to prevent from any type of catastrophic event any fuel from getting into that Red Hill shaft area. So we have an active, so we'll be spending $60 million over the course of the next 2 years to fix that problem, as well as improve other items within Red Hill. And just over the course of the last 8 years, we've spent over $100 million inside Red Hill, improving, modernizing, and making sure that this strategic asset remains safe, remains available to our state, our country, our nation, as we do our business here in the Pacific to keep us all safe. So with that, I think I'm all done. And I think we have our first question, Gary. I'll turn it over to you.
Because there's already dangerous contaminants in the groundwater, isn't it more dangerous to not take action? And I think that's a truism. So I don't know if it's a question. The fact is that we know that the groundwater has been contaminated to some extent. I think you've heard what the actions are so far. If you want to follow up on what additional actions might be required, maybe we can answer that after the meeting. The second question is, how certain are you that the valley fill sections are preventing the lateral migration of contaminated drinking water or contaminated groundwater? And I assume that's referencing one of the cutaways that we have here. I'm not sure which one. But I think this is referring to the underground geology in the Red Hill area, where at the base of the valley there might be some clay or other material that would prevent the groundwater from migrating towards the drinking water wells. I think that's the crux of this question. And ultimately, how certain am I, or how certain is anyone in the room? I'd say not very certain, which is why we're doing the additional monitoring. Or where is the Navy Emergency preparedness plan for the Red Hill facility? If there were a catastrophic release or another leak, what is the emergency response plan?
Introduce yourself, Scott. I'm Scott Hedrick. I'm the senior civilian that operates the fuel facility with the NAVSUB Fleet Logistics Center here in Pearl Harbor. I will tell you that we've done extensive research into a potential release from the Red Hill fuel facility. Although we consider a catastrophic response to be highly unlikely just based upon the construction, we've done the studies. We've looked to see what impacts could come from earthquakes, from pipe failures, from tank failures. We've developed contingency response plans associated with the Hawaii Department of Health, emergency responders throughout the state and local governments. These plans are in place. I keep a copy not only in my office, but I keep a copy in my car so that we're ready to set up an incident command post at the now and react to an emergency if it does occur. We've trained over 100 federal firefighters and Honolulu Fire Department personnel in the facility and actually conducted multi-agency exercises to assure that we can react to an emergency.
Captain Wheeler, did you want to add anything to that? Okay. The next question is, what is the current pipe flow used to distribute the fuel? Is it automatic or manual? So I'm assuming this is talking about the flow of petroleum into and out of the tanks. How is it controlled? Is it automatic or is there a manual override? Okay, so from the tanks to Pearl Harbor to fill vessels or tanker trucks.
It's a great question. Thank you. You have a system of pipes that go from the tanks in Red Hill through the tunnel that you've seen pictures of throughout this presentation. Throughout sections of that pipeline, there are automatic control valves in place throughout the facility, inside the underground pump house, and outside at several valve chambers between Red Hill, ultimately to the piers at Pearl Harbor. The control room in the underground pump house, which is located on the Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, actually has a modernized computer system that through the click of a mouse will open, regulate the opening and closing of these valves, which can increase or decrease pressure or close. Tied to that system, if one of the tanks were to have an emergency in them, a high level, these valves would automatically close. The valves, or correction, the pumps associated with the system are also controlled with the click of a mouse. Throughout that entire facility, we have over 53 environmental cameras associated with it. So as our control room operator is starting, stopping, controlling the function or the flow of fuel, we can not only rove with personnel, but we can also observe the critical nodes where the valves are, where the flanges are, with cameras so that we can see a problem at the now if that problem is occurring. And the last line of defense, as the fuel exits the tank and then goes into a ship, we actually have a person monitoring the pipeline throughout the tunnel system, monitoring the separate person monitoring the pipeline that goes from the tunnel complex to the piers, and then we always have a person that is located at the valve. So if there's a problem anywhere within that system, they can automatically, I don't want to say automatically, they can manually shut it so that we have two forms of protection, one automatic and one manual. Sir?
Thank you for that. That's all the cards I have. We have a question here, Jonathan Starr from the State Water Commission.
Okay, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for your service. Captain, can you give us an estimate of how much fuel the Navy thinks may have leaked from the entire battery of 20 tanks since their inception in the 1940s, and also how much was put into the disposal pit that used to be used when you would clean out the tanks back in the old days?
That's a great question. I'll take a quick stab at just general answering the question, and then we'll see if we've done that and offer some specifics. So it is really difficult to get an actual accounting of the amount of fuel that that's left the tanks over time since the inception. We didn't have, early days, there was not a reporting requirement to report that. We didn't have sophisticated tools to be able to record that. If you saw in the back, I believe Department of Health has gone and combed through the records from 1943 to 1983 and have come up with, you know, a number of events that have been reported, all of which weren't releases, but they were all reported events. So I don't have an exact number for you. We'd like to get an exact number. What I think is important is to understand that, you know, we understand that some fuel has gotten into the ground, and that's driven us to go and do site characterization. That's driven us to go and do fate and transport modeling. That's driven us to put monitoring wells in. And so we're actively monitoring the groundwater wells in those areas. We're seeing that the wells aren't spiking in, you know, in any sense. And we see that as you move away from the Red Hill shaft through our monitoring well structure, that the contamination goes down significantly. And so the monitoring wells all have a series of action level steps that we've agreed to with Department of Health. And we've only, prior to this event, we've only had one instance where we've ever reached an actionable level, and that was during one of the quarterly sampling events that occurred in the vicinity of tank number 5. And so it immediately went back down again. So we don't know what caused that spike, but suffice it to say that the fuel is not getting into our water source. And if I may, Gary mentioned and stated a fact that we have found a trace amount of naphthalene in the Red Hill drinking water source. That hit was right on the edge, and he correctly articulated, right on the edge of detection. And our ability to detect is improving every day. We want it to improve every day. But what we cannot do, there is a possibility or a likelihood that this pit that you mentioned, which has been completely cleared and blessed from Department of Health in terms of having been sufficiently remediated, that we don't know where that very tiny minuscule amount of fuel fuel constituent in our drinking water, we don't know where that came from. It may have come from Red Hill. It may have come from the pit. It may have come from something completely different. We don't know. And so I think this advanced monitoring, the additional work that we're doing, will help us understand going forward how we can best protect our water source.